NBA free agency is less than 3 days away as I record this podcast, and the Atlanta Hawks are very much in the middle of everything after the John Collins trade. We'll talk about Donovan Williams, a certain date on the calendar coming this week on June 29th to circle with regard to the Hawks roster, some mailbag questions, and more. All of that on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1509 of Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Tuesday evening into Wednesday. And today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. If you're a first-time user, you can get 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That is PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. Also, I want to encourage you to make us your first listen each and every day at the Locked On Hawks podcast. Follow us anywhere you get your podcast, places like Apple and Spotify, as well as YouTube on the video side. And today, it's Tuesday evening into Wednesday, and NBA free agency is looming. We are less than 72 hours away from the official start of free agency. The Hawks will have cap space, but it's certainly plenty to monitor with regard to the activity. That's kind of the unofficial start of the real mayhem of the offseason. There's been a lot that's happening already this time around across the league. On today's podcast, we get into actually sort of the latest news, as well as the sort of look ahead to free agency, at least briefly. A big date to circle, June 29th, only 2 days away from that particular day. And then at the end of the podcast, some mailbag questions from you, the listener and viewer of the podcast. First, though, some plugs. I talked extensively about the John Collins trade in emergency fashion on Monday evening. That is still very relevant in this podcast feed, as well as a two-part episode I did with Brian Schroeder before that on the entire NBA draft class for the Hawks, Kobe Buffkin, Mohamed Gay, Seth Lundy, etc. That is all very relevant. And again, please subscribe to the podcast. But right after that show went up on Monday, within really minutes, and this is kind of the way it always works, after I posted the reaction podcast about 5 p.m. on Monday, the Hawks announced that they had waived Donovan Williams. Now, this is not huge news, but it's notable for sure, and that Williams was under contract on a two-way contract for the upcoming season for the Hawks. As far as basketball is concerned, it's interesting and notable because they definitely saw talent in Donovan Williams back in January when they signed him. He's 21 years old. He has real athletic tools. It's pretty normal to cycle through two ways. They kind of are pretty easy to move on from if a team's not in love with that player anymore. But, he only appeared twice for the Hawks in about 3 months in actual just total garbage time. And on the roster side, waiving Williams means that only Miles Norris is currently on a two-way deal for the Hawks. And as a reminder now, in the new CBA, there are 3 two-way spots. In previous years, it's been 2. And some teams will only carry 1, but usually the Hawks have the full allotment. So you can have up to 3 two-way contracts, and I recommend having 3 because there's no reason not to. They could very easily sign one or both of the second-round picks, Mohamed Gay or Seth Lundy, to two-way contracts if they want to do that. They may not want to because the rookie minimum is a lot cheaper than a regular contract, so they might want longer control on Lundy, Gay, or both. And by the way, the rookie minimum is about $1.1 million. That's well below what any of the non-guaranteed players on the Hawks roster are set to make this year, from Martin to Krejci to Fernando, etc. And also of note, two-way contracts often get settled around Summer League, either before, during, or after. If someone kind of breaks out, maybe the Hawks want to sign that guy off somebody else's team or whatever. There's flexibility there. No reason to panic here, but Donovan Williams is no longer in the plans in the short term. Again, free agency officially begins on Friday. I will start with that now. 6 p.m. Eastern time on Friday night is the start of free agency. Of course, there is no tampering at all in the meantime. I'm kidding, because there's obviously people talking right now. That's kind of the way things work in the NBA. At the moment, the Hawks are again well over the salary cap, but after the Collins trade, because official on July 6th, the Hawks will have some room under the luxury tax, about $147 or so $1 million committed on guaranteed contracts, another handful of millions on non-guaranteed deals for Bruno Fernando, Garrison Matthews, Tyrese Martin, and Beat Krejci. While we're here, by the way, I'll say something that's already frustrating me a little bit, and that's that some are framing the Hawks as being worried about the second apron in the new CBA, and that's why they traded Collins, for instance. The Hawks have never been anywhere close to the second apron, and they would not have been at the second apron no matter what. Even if there were no CBA changes, the Hawks were not going to be approaching that level of spending. They just have never done that in the history of this regime. So it's convenient to bring that up as a talking point, as sort of a scare tactic. But the Hawks have not gone over the line at all in a decade, and there are teams with second apron concerns like the Warriors or the Suns. The Hawks are not going to pay the second apron no matter what. So there you go. At least I'll put that out there now. I'd be very, very, very shocked. I shouldn't say 0%, but very, very shocked. A couple more notes here before we get to some players. For one thing, the Hawks could be in the market to use their mid-level exception, depending on how close they want to get the tax, or also the willingness potentially to go over it again. for those that may not know, the mid-level actually can be used on any single free agent. Starts at $12.4 million is the most you can offer up to 4 years. It also can be for less than that if they want to agree to a contract. And basically, without doing the entire spiel, it's an exception that lets you exceed the salary cap to sign a player if you use it within those constraints. So as discussed on the Collins Emergency podcast on Monday evening, the Hawks could also use the trade exception that they created in the deal. Once that's done, it's always hard to figure out who that player is going to be without knowing specifics there, but that's also an option. Also, before free agency even starts, notable as well, the Hawks are going to be free to negotiate extensions finally with Dejounte Murray, Onyeka Okongwu, and Saddiq Bey. A short reminder here, but Murray is a guy that the Hawks are limited in what they actually are allowed to offer him. And no one that I have talked to, literally no one, believes that he's going to sign that. Maybe he will. Maybe there is something in Dejounte that just wants the security. I wouldn't blame him for that. But I think that I would be shocked that happened. At least pretty surprised that happened. I think you shouldn't expect a deal in a hurry for Okongwu or Bey. It's definitely possible. And a lot of times, rookie scale extensions like those go on for a while. They can be negotiated quickly in July, or maybe they go closer to October on the deadline. So there's no like imminence with regard to Bey or Okongwu that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that they'll be talking all summer long with those guys. Both guys also in kind of weird situations too. Saddiq Bey is not really a proven starter right now in the NBA. Just got here a few months ago, of course. He's a very good player, very useful, but not like a proven high level starter. Okongwu, I think, is a starting center in the league for sure, but he's never been actually asked to do that in the league. Capela's still on the team right now, so some conflicting incentives there. So some tricky negotiations for the Hawks and those players. As far as what the Hawks can actually do in actual free agency, one sort of nitpicking thing that I will say, the Hawks do not have cap space. So if you're referring to cap space, the Hawks don't have it. They're well over the cap, but they can sign some players. I might hit on some options for the trade section at some point in time. But for the mid-level, I'm going to list some guys, basically, that the Hawks could use part of the mid-level or even all of the mid-level to sign. I'm not saying these are all great options, that I would love all these guys, but certainly I can make a case for all the players I'm about to name on some level. And again, I really pick guys that kind of fit the Hawks, like no, only small offense point guards, no centers on this list, for instance, but this could change depending on what the Hawks do in trades. But this is not in order either. So, for instance, Gabe Vincent and Max Strus are free agents from the Heat. Gabe Vincent, two-way guard, not a great offensive player, but certainly can guard. Max Strus, a great shooter, decent enough defender. Interesting guys. Dylan Brooks, I wouldn't advocate that, but he's a pretty volatile option. He is an excellent defensive player. I'll say that. Could be available for that. There are some guys that I think would not probably take the mid-level. That's like Grant Williams, Harrison Barnes, Bruce Brown. Those are like the guys I think might get more or just may not come to Atlanta for obvious reasons. Dante DiVincenzo from the Warriors is now a free agent. Javon Carter is one that I would circle as a defensive guard who can kind of shoot as well in that kind of DeLon Wright role where you don't have him running the offense, but he's a bigger and better version of Aaron Holiday, kind of like a big guard, really good defender, and can shoot it. That's a very interesting fit for the Hawks. Old pal Dennis Schroeder, I actually would be interested in. It's been a while now. I kind of famously made fun of the fact that the Hawks were trying to spin it where Dennis and Trey would play together, and then they traded Dennis very shortly after that. It's been 5 years, though. In fact, he's never played with anyone on the Hawks roster, at least in Atlanta. So he actually played well defensively this year for the Lakers. Could be a nice backup guard option for Atlanta. Speaking of Lakers, Lonnie Walker, not a great fit, but certainly a decent enough player. Karis LeVert was a pretty good defender this year for Cleveland. Some offensive stuff there for sure, but he could be available. Patrick Beverley is near the end of his career probably, but a useful role player with some attitude and some physicality and can shoot a little bit. Can teach Kobe Buckins some tricks on the margins. Ayo Dosunmu, another Bulls guy, but more of a younger, restricted player, can also defend. And, I can go on and on with this. There's a very long list. I'll just name some more guys, just mostly just names here. Jalen McDaniels, Torrey Craig, Terrence Davis, Trey Lyles, Dennis Smith Jr., Josh Richardson. Matisse Thybulle is restricted, but certainly could be a good defender. Gwinnett County's own Josh Okogie, Keita Bates-Diop, Shake Milton, Joe Ingles, former Hawk Damian Lee, Yuta Watanabe, Jay Crowder, who's from locally Villa Rica, Troy Brown Jr., Nickeil Alexander-Walker, O'Shea Brissett, and I think I'm also contractually obligated to say Cam Reddish is a free agent. I wouldn't recommend it probably, but he is available on some level. So that's a long list. Obviously, it will all depend on what the Hawks are prioritizing. There's different archetypes there. Like I think they could certainly use broad strokes, another guard who can at least handle the ball a little bit and also defend while Kobe Bucking gets up to speed. More of a short-term thing there in that role. Also, you can't have too many wings. You can't have too many shooters. Those are all things to keep in mind, especially defensive wings on this roster right now without Collins. You're going to be playing more of Saddiq Bey, who's not a great defender, more of Bogey, not a great defender, AJ Griffin, same thing. So keep that in mind for now. But lots of flexibility if they want to use it, and a bunch of guys who are not like fantastic, but who are rotation caliber players that they can potentially add to this roster via the mid-level if they want to. Last thing before we get to a break, this is the date that I told you to circle earlier. So on June 29th, i.e., that is this Thursday coming up, is actually a pretty sneaky important day for the Hawks. At the moment, Bruno Fernando and Garrison Matthews are both on non-guaranteed contracts. On June 29th, basically, I should say at the end of the day on June 29th, I believe, but certainly that is the date, they become guaranteed for the season. Now, at the moment, the Hawks could cut either one of them and pay them $0. Once the day actually arrives on Thursday, Bruno becomes guaranteed for about $2.58 million, Matthews $2 million for upcoming season. In my view, those are both good contracts for what they actually are. Bruno is a solid third center, even a capable number 2 center on some teams. Matthews, a nice sort of fringy rotation guard, but can shoot a little bit, and that's a lot. It's not a lot of money at all for him. At the same time, the Hawks might want to keep both, and I probably would, honestly, in a vacuum, but they might want more roster flexibility, might have a different plan. We will see on all of that. Again, personally, I would guarantee both of them, because even if you didn't want to keep Fernando and Matthews, I am very sure you could trade either one of them pretty easily at that deal for less than $3 million each. They have non-guarantees in the future as well, so if you like them at all, they could give you more value down the line and some flexibility there. So at the moment, Bruno and Garrison are like in the top 11 or 12 on the roster in terms of guys who are ready to play right now. I'm not saying that's incredibly sexy, because it's not, but they are useful, like back-end rotation kind of players, and those are actually providing real depth and real value. So we'll talk about that more later on this week, but it's something to keep an eye on. June 29th is a sneaky important date. Obviously, the 30th is when the bonanza begins on Friday, but the Hawks actually have 2 decisions to make in less than 48 hours, basically, from the time you're listening to this podcast on Wednesday. All right, we'll get into more on the intro presser from Monday, actually, on the rookie side, some more rumblings and the latest trade stuff. And then later on in the podcast, we will be discussing some mailbag questions. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is sponsored by eBay Motors. For championship teams, I want to make sure that every single player on your roster is a perfect fit for you. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part has to fit just right for your car. Next time you look for parts or accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure that every single part that you need happens to fit right and does so the first time around. Add your ride to My Garage. Look for the green check, so the part will be actually fitting, or your money will be coming back to you. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop at eBay Motors. Over 122 million parts to choose from. You'll be back in the game in absolutely no time. After all, it's much easier to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed for you. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. One more time, that is ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, and in the wildness of the John Collins trade on Monday, I didn't even talk about the introductory press conference that the Hawks held on Monday morning. I will say it's available entirely to watch on the Hawks YouTube page if you want to watch the whole thing. Not a ton of news from it, honestly, and it's always good to get familiar with the players. I know fans like to do that. I don't blame you at all. Not the most revelatory thing from a basketball standpoint. I do want to play one clip for you. You'll hear the question also, but Landry Fields was basically asked what appealed to the Hawks from all 3 players they drafted. And again, just a reminder, it's Kobe Buffkin, Seth Lundy, and Mohamed Gay. It's one long answer from Landry, but it's a basketball answer. This is a basketball podcast, so it's like 2.5 minutes long. So it's worth listening to just for the synopsis from the front office. And here's Landry Fields on why basically the Hawks drafted Kobe Buffkin, Seth Lundy, and Mohamed Gay.
Landry, this question is for you. You said you've been watching these guys for a while. Can you kind of maybe go into a bit more detail as to maybe was it anything or other factors that you liked about these guys for you to be able to draft them now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, starting with Seth, kudos to Mo. He's been scouting the NBA. At this level, having the ability to shoot is crucial. Don't always have to have it, but it comes at a premium at this level. And he's a guy that, when you watch him, there's a difference between a guy that shoots him because just they can, and there's a guy that knows they're a shooter, and like they have the identity of that. And that's what Seth has. And he's got an NBA body today. And for us and how we're trying to build, like shooting is a premium for our system. And that's something that is going to be really good for us. And with Kobe here, the versatility that he has with the ball, without the ball, like watching him from year 1 to year 2, the defensive mindset that he has, having a chance to talk with him at the combine, it's very rare to have a lot of the tools that you see externally, but the internal drive and the IQ that kind of brings it all together. Dwight Lutz in our front office has said that feel actualizes potential. And for Kobe, like, that is something that is crucial. And for him and his ceiling, this is gonna be really big for him. Playing on ball, off ball, the ability to defend, him taking pride in that. You know, we need more defensive capability with our team. So something that stood out very early on with Kobe, and then with Mo here, Mo's taken a huge jump from year 1 to year 2. You know, he's got an unbelievable wingspan, which I had that as a player. And the tools that he has at his size is rare. You don't see that very often. And just our assessment of him and his athleticism, the body type that he has, his ability to move his feet defensively to where we can see cross matchups. That's something that he's going to grow into. He mentioned his shooting earlier. He's not a non-shooter at all. Like, he can shoot the ball, but we want to get that to a consistent level to where he's an unbelievable threat on both sides of the ball. And that's something for him he's going to grow more and more into. But the potential for him and all three of these guys is really, really high. And I think that we have the staff to absolutely get the most out of them. And I'm excited for them to watch their development over the next few years, however long that is. Like, we're excited about the process with all of them.
Other than that, that's kind of it for the intro press conference, in my view. Again, if you want to watch the whole thing, it is available for you on the Hawks YouTube page. From there, some rumblings still happening in the trade world for the Hawks. They are by no means done making calls. They could be done with major moves. They may not be. We will see in the future. But obviously, things have kind of reset after the Collins trade. One thing that I heard today that I believe is that it's unlikely that Rudy Gay will be on the team this season. Now, I speculated this on Monday's podcast on the Emergency Show, but I heard more to that and on today, basically, talking behind the scenes to some people around the Hawks. And then Lauren Woods of the AJC also reported, citing sources familiar with the situation, saying the Hawks were trying to trade Gay if they can, and if not, they will probably waive him. I have heard the same. So we will see. By the way, waiving him could be a buyout if they wanted to, or they can potentially just waive him to create the roster spot. From what I heard again on yesterday's podcast, he is not probably an NBA caliber player at this point in time. No shade to Rudy Gay. He's had a really good career. He's just an older guy. He's probably just at the end at this point. It's even further entrenched now, so I just want to put that out there. That might be a little bit in terms of like flexibility and money stuff. Keep an eye on that space in the coming days, a la what happened with Mo Harkless a year ago. Woj said on TV, I think on Monday night or Tuesday, that basically everyone has been available still other than Trey. That has been the case the entire time. I know Jake Fisher reported that at one point. I talked about it on my show just a few days ago. It remains to be seen how much urgency, though, there is for more deals after they've cut Collins' salary. A lot of what I've heard in the market, basically, that the Hawks have a little bit less urgency right now because they've already made one of their big swings to cut money, and that was like priority number one, was to get off some money, and that already happened. On that of the trade, Jeff Schultz of The Athletic reported that Dejounte Murray, quote, almost certainly is not going anywhere, end quote. He did say that several teams have been calling on Murray, but there have been indications for weeks, as I'm quoting Jeff now, that he's well-liked by Fields and Snyder, and it's highly improbable the Hawks get enough assets in return to make it basically worth it for them after what they traded for him last summer. So that makes sense to me. Not a surprise, really, at all. I've heard he was available, but never framed to me as it was like they were shopping him or that was likely to happen. It would seemingly have to be like for a big swing. I think like the Pascal Siakam thing would maybe involve Dejounte Murray, but it have to be a deal like that. They're not trying, at least that I've heard, to kind of trade Murray for other parts. It's more of like a consolidation push for another player that's either at his level or higher than his level at this point in time. Also, Jake Fisher had a big notebook on Tuesday. I also recommend reading Jake for context reasons on Yahoo. Nothing big there from the Hawks necessarily. Basically noted active conversations around DeAndre Hunter still happening right now. He also listed the Hawks as a team with previous interest in KJ Martin from the Rockets. I talked about that a little bit on this podcast before. Like, there was a rumor out there about Capella for KJ Martin with Houston, who has a bunch of cap space. That's just notable. I'm not sure it's still alive at all at this point in time, nor did Jake say that, but Houston could be in the market for Capella. I thought they were a sneaky Collins team on some level, maybe even Hunter. So Houston's trying to win now and has a bunch of cap space, which means guys like Hunter and Capella, who have big contracts, could be appetizing for Houston if they feel like they can help them right away. And Martin is cheap and young and fairly athletic and interesting at this point in time. All right. We'll break here from our sponsor today's podcast, and we'll end the podcast with some mailbag questions from you. And most of them are focused on like Collins fallout with regard to kind of what happened there. And also if we need to get into more of that stuff in the future, but kind of a final Collins wrap on the mailbag side. But first, a word from our sponsors. If you enjoyed daily fantasy sports, make sure you check out the award-winning app at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. It's amazing. I know that you will love it as well. It's very easy to use. I've been playing there for quite some time now. It's really a breeze to operate within the PrizePicks structure. All you do is pick 2 to 6 players. Actually, choose whether they have more or less than a certain number of points or rebounds, assists, other stats across the basketball world, or in baseball, it's home runs. In NFL, it's yards, etc. And at PrizePicks, with 25 times the money on your entries, they offer sports across the board: NBA, college basketball, NFL, college football, MLB, NHL, PGA, soccer, esports, and much more. And a whole entry can be done in just a minute or less. It's that easy and that quick. Plus, it's just you against the numbers. They have safe and fast withdrawals at PrizePicks, and they're operating in more than 30 states, including Georgia, and they also are operating in Canada. Download the app right now with PrizePicks. Go to PrizePicks.com. Sign up and play daily fantasy sports right now today. If you're a first-time user as well, get 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's right. Enter that promo code Locked On and sign up for the instant deposit match up to $100. Check it out now at PrizePicks. All right, some mailbag questions to hit on now. Some of them in regard to the Collins thing and kind of where the state of the roster is right now. And I have a bunch of these, so I probably won't get to all of them. So thanks for the questions. Always keep them coming for sure. LockedOnHawks@gmail.com, as well as at LockedOnHawks on Twitter, at BT Rowland on Twitter as well. First question comes from Sam, who says, I can't help but think of all the questions about the shooting with Collins and Capella over the years, and now I transfer them over to Jalen Johnson and Capella. Is this silly, or is this the problem? I need to know what's happening. So this will come up, I'm sure, later on in the summer if Capella's still on the team, but it's a very reasonable question. For one thing, despite the 3-month slump this year from Collins as a shooter, he was a much more proven floor spacer as a shooter than Jalen is right now. That's part of this. The other side of this is that I expect and would hope the Hawks are not going to go ask Jalen to stand in the corner like they did with Collins. I think Jalen is much more talented with the ball in his hands on the perimeter, much more comfortable in that than John Collins is. Collins is a better shooter, but Jalen's more comfortable on that perimeter role, much better passer, all that stuff. That appeals to Quinn Snyder, I'm sure. I do think that probably in a vacuum, you want to limit the amount of time when you're playing Jalen and Clint together just for spacing reasons. And if you do that, you probably want to have a lot of shooting on the perimeter. Maybe have Bogey out there, or AJ out there, plus Trey, etc. Make sure you don't have I wouldn't be trying to play Hunter, Jalen, and Capella, let's say. I'd kind of want to go more in the AJ or Bogey direction at the 3, etc., just to provide some more space around those guys. But I would try to basically roughly, not always by any means, but kind of roughly pair Clint with Saddiq Bey for defense and rebounding to give more space when Clint plays as well on offense with Bey. And then also use Jalen and Okongwu. Those guys play well together already. They kind of fit well, as far as their tools and their size, and Jalen can help Okongwu rebound, all that stuff. So that's a rough synopsis. I'll have much more depth on that in the future, but it's a reasonable question. Jalen and Capella, not the greatest fit in the world, kind of in similar ways to Collins, but Jalen is much different in the fact that he can have the ball on the perimeter and much more of a threat as a passer and playmaker than Collins was. Next question comes from James. You said you wouldn't talk about Collins much, and I get why, but I'm curious what you think about Collins' fit with the Jazz. It doesn't seem great to me, and there's been a lot of talk about it. So I'll be short about this. This is not a Jazz podcast. I recommend listening to Locked On Jazz if you want to follow some Collins stuff in the future. I'll say this. Danny Ainge has always liked John Collins, dating back to Boston. There's always been rumors around Danny Ainge and Collins. It's not the same kind of fit that I mentioned before with teams like the Thunder or the Pacers with Collins, where you're pairing him with a shooting center. I think Walker Kessler, not the best fit in the world for Collins on offense. Probably a little bit better than Clint, but not a ton. There is probably a path to having Collins play more at center in Utah, which I think is probably going to be part of the plan there, according to Tony Jones of The Athletic, who covers the team very well. Next to Kelly Olynyk, potentially. Also, Utah does not have 2 starting centers to deal with, like Capella and Okongwu. You can play Collins more at the 5. Crucially, though, Utah does not have Trae Young either. And I think while there's been some weird talk about how Trae made Collins worse, it's actually the opposite. Trae makes everybody better, generally speaking. So that was never the problem. Trae and Collins always played well together. Anyway, importantly speaking, Utah's still in rebuilding mode, so we're still not exactly sure what they're trying to do with their roster. But I would say, in short, to answer the question and move on, not the best situation for Collins, not the worst, but not what you would drop in a lab for sure. The last question I think we'll probably get to today on the podcast, a little bit shorter one in the middle of the week, as we'll have plenty more come in the future as things get even busier. Carl asks, in the end, the Hawks got 1 protected first-round pick for Kevin Huerter and John Collins and absolutely nothing back in players. Whose fault is this? Who can I yell about or at, I suppose? Thank you for the question. I think I put this in a couple of different buckets as far as how we got here, basically, because I think it's not crazy to lump these deals together. They're not exactly the same by any means, but they're similar in nature. Number one, I would say a lack of organizational direction and cohesion over the last several years. There was plenty of reporting about how the Hawks have had some mess with the management system, having to do with Tony Ressler on down. Travis is gone now, but he was in the mix for some of these deals. The voices in the room that are kind of there with the Hawks, I think, are a little bit more sorted out now, it seems like, with Landry and Kyle and Quinn as kind of the brain trust, but lots of voices over the last couple of years. And there's been plenty of reporting about that. No reason to kind of relitigate that now. But you could go even as far back as to like when the Hawks chose to speed up the rebuild, like even faster than they were going to. I think it was been reported, and I think it's true, that ownership got impatient and wanted to have better results faster, and they ended up signing Bogey and Gallo. And that worked on some level because they made the conference finals next year. But I think we probably have seen now and kind of definitively that the Hawks kind of tricked themselves with that run. They were probably not as good as that team actually ended up being in the playoffs. We've seen that now. Even that year in the regular season, they've not had a regular season that's been worthy of that kind of level at any point in the Trae Young era. They had basically one half season in that year. And it was a magical run. It was the best run this team's ever had as far as like depth in the conference finals. But as far as like team quality, they were not that good, but they also paid for a team that was that good. And then sort of the conflicting messaging and actions that I've talked about a lot when it comes to winning now, but also not being willing to kind of tweak on the margins, take steps back, but also not being willing to spend big in the way that they would have had to probably. Because if your plan was to pay everyone, and by the way, the Hawks have basically paid everyone along the way, you can't really do that and up the tax. That doesn't make sense. So that's sort of the lack of organizational cohesion around the entire thing in the last 3 or 4 years. From there, I would say this. I think the Hawks did not do a good job on the negotiations for either Hunter or Collins in extensions. The Herder signing, I think looked pretty good, and even looks better now than it did then. I think it would have been very helpful, and I said this before, so my apologies for repeating myself, but the Hawks could have, and I'm not someone who just says things out of willy-nilly here. The Hawks, this was a talking point in the league when it happened. There were not really any strong bidders against the Hawks at the time they decided to pay John 5 for 125, and they probably could have squeezed him more, and they didn't do that, and that's bitten them, I think, at this point in time. The same goes for Hunter, who the Hawks also gave money to. Honestly, I think more than most people in the league believe that they were going to that summer. When that deal happened, it was a surprise. It wasn't like a total shock, but the number that it came in at was a deal that people were surprised by, let's just say. I've heard some mixed stuff behind the scenes in the last 2 years about how much of that was like driven from the top, and by the top I mean like ownership level on down. But there was kind of out of nowhere that the deal got done at a pretty high number, so that was not a great situation in terms of like negotiations. And then of course again the Herder deal was a good one when the Hawks signed it, and it still is. But they clearly chose finances over getting more in terms of player value for Herder. Now the first round pick does help. I've always wanted to stress that there wasn't like a total dump. The Collins deal is a dump. With Kevin Herder, they got a first-round pick. That does matter as long as you get the first-round pick. I don't love that trade still, but that's a much better asset coming back than what they actually got for Collins. Also on this list, Tony Ressler reportedly, and I have heard this, vetoed at least one trade for John Collins previously. That was a better return by a lot than what they actually got this time around. Now, I'll be very clear about this. That was not this cycle. This cycle, once it became clear they were going to try to trade him again, his value, they basically sold as low as possible on John Collins, which is bad organizational process in general. If they traded him 2 years ago, they would have gotten more. If they traded him last year, they would have gotten more, etc. I don't want to be too demonstrative about this because I don't have it completely 100% nailed down, all the specifics. But again, I've heard repeatedly that Ressler and the ownership level vetoed at least one trade. There's one of them that I'm very confident about, but maybe even one of that. But let's just say, again, the return would have been much better then. So you don't want to just say like revisionist history, but I do believe strongly that the Hawks could have moved him for much better returns in the past, and they didn't. So there you go. And then again, the prioritization of cost cutting in both deals. I spent a lot of time on this with the Collins thing, so I won't do the whole thing again. But the question was asked basically to me on this mailbag question about getting only one first round pick for these two guys. It has to be said once again that the Hawks chose this route in terms of what they wanted to get back in these deals. We could argue this back and forth, and I will let people do that. And I at some point I will engage, but it's almost, as far as answer the question, in the case of Herder, they took back shorter, cheaper salary that made the team worse and basically chose money and that pick, notably. With Collins, the deal had less value than Herder's deal, no question about that on the market. But instead of taking money back and getting maybe an asset or a player in exchange, they chose to cut money for nothing in return. So they chose this prioritization of what those deals are. So if you were going to trade Kevin Herder and John Collins, you could have gotten more in player assets. You could have gotten more in draft assets, or maybe even both, but it would have come at the cost of spending more money, and they didn't do that. So overall, it looks like really bad process. To answer the question, like if you just said, okay, go back 2 years, go back 3 years and say, this is what they're going to get for Kevin Huerter and John Collins. That does not look good, and that's not appropriate, and that's really, really not good process for the front office, especially when you drafted these guys in the first round, but in the back half of the first round, it hit on both of them. They both became starting caliber players. That's really, really good results in the draft, and you turn them into very little. Now, the Kings pick could be very helpful. I'll say that right now. And I believe going into next year, if I had to guess right now, the Kings pick will be coming to Atlanta, and they'll actually be able to kind of restock a little bit with that pick. But it's one pick, and they got 0 from the players in that deal, Justin Holiday and Mo Harkless. The Collins deal, same thing. Rudy Gay is not going to give them anything. So the price that they're paying right now is the questionable team building choices along the way. So that's kind of the reality of what happened in the last calendar year or so. There's lots of questions about the way this team has been run. On the bright side, they've drafted well. I will say that. Really, in the entire Schlenk plus Trae Young era, basically, they've only made one first-round pick that I objectively think was terrible, and it was Amari Spellman, and that was the 30th pick of the draft. Even the Hunter and Reddish picks have not worked out fantastically. I didn't like the Hunter trade at the time. Those were very defensible picks. A lot of, especially the pick, not necessarily a trade for Hunter, but the pick of Reddish where it was, all that stuff. They've gotten some good stuff in the draft. They've obviously gotten Trae breaking out. They traded for Dejounte. They paid a high price, but they got a good player. It's that they've not always worked well on the margins. That was one of my primary complaints with Travis Schlenk in the entire era, was that the process was not very good. Travis is a very good scout, very good talent evaluator, but the margins and the trade processes and the trade returns and the asset evaluations, all that stuff was not the best. And that's been still the case now. And we'll see if this new regime has it any differently, because right now I have a hard time blaming them. That's not really their fault. They're taking over this. They didn't sign these contracts and all that stuff, but they're doing what's been done right now. And we'll see what the next step is. But to answer the question, not great necessarily to get only one pick and they have it be pretty protected for both those guys in terms of process. Okay. I will save the rest of my notes for today's podcast for later. The summer league schedule is out. There is some league roster stuff that I've heard. We'll see. It will not be announced, I think, until at least later this week. The Hawks are generally one of the last teams to announce their summer league roster. So I saw at least one team announced today. So we're getting into that range. But again, as a reminder, June 29th, deadline day for Garrison Matthews and Bruno Fernando. June 30th is the start of free agency, and also the time when the Hawks start negotiating extensions over the weekend with players like Murray if they want to try that, or Okongwu or Bay, and those dialogues can open legally at that point in time. So plenty to discuss in the future. I'll have at least one more show this week. I don't know when it's going to be, maybe Thursday, maybe Friday, we'll see, but I've already had 3 or 4 shows this week. It's been very, very busy on the podcast for the last several weeks. If there's big news, I think I've proven at this point, but I will jump back in and dive into whatever's going on in Hawks land. But that's where we are right now. And I do appreciate everybody listening to the podcast. Please subscribe to the show on any podcast platform. I know that I saw Stitcher is closing down in the near future, so don't do that necessarily, but go with Apple Podcasts and Spotify and the Odyssey app and YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. We should be there. And if we're not there, let me know. I'll get that fixed in the near future. Follow the show on Twitter @LockedOnHawks. Follow me on Twitter @BT Rowland. We'll see everybody next time.